Okay. Good morning. Okay. I want to talk about the Ethiopian Jews / Gerim sugya controversy in Eretz Yisrael. I want to start like this. In Israel, there's a very prominent protest culture. I think all of us know what that is. It's a prominent protest culture. When you don't like something, you go on the streets, you protest about it, you scream. In the 50s and 60s, it was mostly Naturi Karta who did the screaming. Later on, it was other people. In 2015, there was a large, violent protest in, I think, Yerushalayim, of the Ethiopian community. Basically, what happened is there was a video that everyone saw of two Israeli policemen beating an Ethiopian soldier in uniform for whatever minor infraction he had committed. And this led to big protests about police brutality. And there was big protests in Israel, all over the country. Violent, big protests. Now, what this led people to remember was of the pre-existing protest culture of the Ethiopian community in Eretz Yisrael. Now, one of the most famous protests that ever happened in Israel's history was the protest in 1985 of the Ethiopian community. It was very different than other protests. It was a few thousand people who camped out in Yerushalayim outside Heichel Yitz, I forgot what it's called actually, but the office of the chief rabbinate, the main office of the chief rabbinate, and they camped out outside the offices of the chief rabbinate for several months. They brought at least a month, maybe a little longer. They brought tents. They had food set up. They were cooking. They were making fires in the square. It was like a very, very. It was a tourist attraction. People came from all over the country to see how the Ethiopians were living outside the chief rabbinate's office in Yerushalayim in 1985. And eventually this protest subsided, and it went the way all protests go, and it went away. Now, what was this protest about in 1985? So different than a lot of other protests. It was a protest about the chiyuv of hatafas dam bris. That's what it was. It was there. In that time, many thousands of Ethiopian immigrants had just made it to Eretz Yisrael. The chief rabbinate at the time was insisting that everybody needed to do a geirus l'chumra. They had to do a hatafas dam bris and a tefillah and a mikveh and a geirus l'chumra. And because of that, these thousands of Ethiopians were insulted. They felt this was beneath their dignity, it was beneath their kavod, and they camped out outside the rabbinut in Yerushalayim to protest this psak. And strangely, I think this would surprise some people, the psak changed. Yeah, and is somewhat uncommon for a psak to be protested against, and that's a way of changing the psak. But strangely, the psak changed, and a lot of them no longer needed to get hatafas dam bris and the like. Now, so it's strange when a psak changes. It's strange when there's public protests, camping out, cooking and living outside the rabbinut. This is a very strange episode in halakha. And I want to just take it back a few notches and explain who these people are, where they came from, what the halakha shaylas were, which psak they were protesting, which psak eventually changed in their favor, and etc. So now, first, before we start this, we have to know there's a din as follows. If a Jew, someone shows up and shows up tomorrow to our area and says, I'm a Jew, I come from the family of whatever name you want to pick, nobody knows who I am, but I'm a Jew, I'm a regular Jew. Are you allowed to get him? Are you allowed to be a shadchan and marry him off to a regular Jewish girl or not? Now, this actually happened a few years ago. There was a guy who faked being a Jew, I think, like a Lebanese guy. He said he was Jewish, and they married him off. It turns out he wasn't Jewish. But so this, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch and Even Ezer, and I just want to set the table with this, and then we'll move on to the stories of who these Ethiopians are and where they came from. But the Shulchan Aruch in Even Ezer and Siman Beis says as follows. It says, Kol ha-mishpachis, all families, becheskes kashrus, are considered kosher. Umutter lisa mehem l'chatchila. You're allowed to marry from them l'chatchila. V'afal pikein, imrisa beis mishpachis, and here the Mechaber tells you everything you need to know about shidduchim. He says, Afal pikein, imrisa beis mishpachis, you see two families, shemizgares zubazu tamid, they're always fighting with each other. Oy beis b'nei adam shemizgaren zubazu, they're always fighting with each other. Oy risa mishpachis shibalas meitzum riva tamid, you see a family that's always fighting with people, not getting along. Oy risa ishu marbe mriva makal, someone who fights with all his neighbors, all his acquaintances, all his partners. V'az panam b'yoseh, then cheshin lahem v'roy l'srachik mehem. So the Mechaber tells you in Shidduchim what you need to look for. Mechaber says if you see someone who's very difficult, always fighting, so them stay away from them. She'elu simani pasel same, because these are simanim that someone might not be kosher. Or someone who's always passing other people. Okay, this is the Mechaber. Now the Mechaber seems to be very lenient about this and says that anytime a Jew shows up and says, I'm a Jew, anytime someone shows up and says, I'm a Jew, you're allowed to trust him, and you can marry him off to whoever it is that he wants to be married off to, unless provided that he doesn't seem to have this difficult personality traits that the Mechaber is bringing down. Now if you look in the Beis Shmuel over here, in Even HaEzer Beis, the Beis Shmuel brings down that in the Torah there's a machlekes about this. Now the Mechaber neglects to bring this; he doesn't bring this machlekes rishonim at all. But the Torah, if you look in the Torah in Siman Beis, the Torah brings down a big machlekes rishonim. The Torah says, he says the Ramah and Rashi, two of the Gedolei rishonim, the Ramah and Rashi, both paskin that if someone here, he says Aval Rashi v'chein kasav Ramah that it says kol mishpachas b'cheskes kashrus. Someone who starts with cheskes kashrus, you don't have to do a bedika after him. But man de leslu cheskes kashrus, someone who you know nothing about, his family is not known, you need a raya to prove that he's kosher. This is what the Ramah says. This is what Rashi holds, and according to some, this is what the Rambam holds. At least in one of the Mahalchim of the Rambam, this is what the Rambam holds. So this is the psak of these Rishonim that says that if you don't know anything about a person, you have to be chayshish for his kashrus, and you need to be beidik in him. Now, Taisvis, Rabbeinu Tam in a few places, Rabbeinu Tam in Yevamis, and Rabbeinu Tam in Psachim, paskins straight away, that anybody who shows up and says that he's a Yid, you're allowed to trust him. Now, there's an interesting Gemara that seems to be a big riot to this. The Gemara in Psachim of Gimel and Beis, it's a Bakante Gemara. The Gemara says like this. There was a guy, it says, Hahu Aramah. There was this guy that would eat from the Karban Pesach every year. He would go up to Eretz Yisrael and he would eat from the Karban Pesach with all the Jews. Amar, he said, and he would make fun. He would come back to where he lived in Bavel and he would say, it says in the pasuk, no guy is allowed to partake from the Karban Pesach, and I eat from the best parts of the Karban Pesach, and nobody says boo. So Amar Rav Yehuda ben Beseira told him, Mika safule me'aliyah, do they give you from the tail portion? Now the tail portion goes to the Mizbeach. Nobody eats from the tail portion. So he tricked him. He said, did they give you from the tail portion? He says, no. So he says, tell them you found out what's really good and you want from the tail. So the next year he goes, Kisalik, he goes up. He tells them, give me from the tail. Don't give me from the shvacha parts. They tell him, the aliyah goes to the Mizbeach. Aliyah doesn't get eaten by a person. Can't give you from the aliyah. So they told him, who instructed you to ask from the aliyah? Meaning, why did you suddenly decide to ask for the aliyah? Rav Yehuda ben Beseira instructed me. Amr Mai, what's this? The kaman, what's going on over here? So Badku Basrei, they looked after him, Vashkechu Daramahu, and they found out that he was really a guy. So Vikatlu, and they killed him. Shalchul Rav Yehuda ben Beseira, they sent Rav Yehuda ben Beseira a message. Shalom L'cha Rav Yehuda ben Beseira, Da'at ben Netzivin and Metudascha Prusa b'Yerushalayim. Like Shalom Aleichem to you. You're sitting all the way over there in Netzivin and Bavel, and still your Metzuda, your net is Prusa b'Yerushalayim. You're taking care of everything in Yerushalayim. So now from this Gemara, says Rabbeinu Tam, you seem to have a pretty clear raya that if a guy presents himself and says he's a Jew, you don't have to think twice. Because this guy showed up, he wanted to eat from the Karban Pesach, he says he's Jewish, so he's Jewish. That's it. Now Rabbeinu Tam himself is matchil this raya and says it's not really such a good raya because over here, most people is a raiv, he says. Most people who show up to partake from the Karban Pesach are Jewish. You don't have to be chayshish. Why would he show up claiming he's Jewish? Like it's too random to presume that he'd be non-Jewish, so you could assume that he must be a Yid. That's Rabbeinu Tam's matchil. Rabbeinu Tam says there are other Gemaras, a Gemara in Asar Yochsin and a Gemara in Yevamis that seem to be mashma that if a guy assumes he's a Jew, he says he's a Jew, you could trust him. So right off the bat, if these Ethiopian communities and deep into Ethiopia who had not seen another Jew in God knows how long, come and they say, Yehudi ani am a Jew, l'chayru would seem like, according to many Rishonim, there's makom to say, okay, if you say you're a Jew, you're a Jew. Now, Lamaisa, no poskim were saimach on that. Even the ones who were makel about them, no poskim were saimach on that because for a few different reasons. First of all, it's not so cut and dry that if a guy says I'm a Jew, you trust him he's a Jew. It seems that you need to rely on the raiv or the chazaka or the presumption of, or his behavior seems like he's a Jew, or the family is somewhat well known, or you've seen people who look like him. So there seems to be, if you look through the poskim, that there's many more caveats and conditions that are part of believing a guy. But the second part and the more integral part of why you can't believe them or couldn't just believe them off the bat is because over here they didn't come and say, I'm a Jew like you, meaning I come from Poland, I'm just a family of another Jew and whatever, and you could trust them. Over here they claimed, I'm a Jew from a tribe of Jews that you don't know about. There's a whole other set of Jews. He's not saying independently, I'm a Jew. He's saying there are other Jews, and I'm from those Jews. For someone to come and claim there are other Jews and I'm from those Jews, though that you have no nemanis to say. That there's another tribe that's somewhere out there that we know nothing about, that doesn't exist, that doesn't have Armin Hagim, we're an alternate sect of Judaism, and I'm from themanis Jews, that a person doesn't have nemanis for. So, off the bat, all the poskim were confronted with the Shaila, were not willing to trust any individual who presented himself and says he was a Jew, and therefore, even though there were some handfuls, minor grouping of Ethiopian Jews that showed up on the scene earlier, before Eretz Yisrael, they were always made to have a gerus l'chumra. They had to have a gerus, they had a tafas tambris, they did a tefillah in a mikveh, and they had a gerus l'chumra. Now, when did this become a very controversial question? It's because during the 1980s, there was a civil war in Sudan and Ethiopia. It's actually raging again now, strangely. The same civil war kicked back up again. But this civil war led to massacres and famine. It was a terrible, terrible time to be alive in that area of the world. And thousands of these Ethiopian Jews, they refer to themselves as the Beta Israel, the Beis Yisrael, Beta Israel. They were referred to by the Ethiopian community as falashas. I think everyone's heard of that. It's really a racist slur. It's really the same as other not nice words used to refer to people of other cultures. It's a racist slur that meant in the local Ethiopian language, it meant outsider, like imposter, outsider. And these people, these is what they refer to. Now, these people for a long time had been claiming that they were Jews and should be treated as such. But during that time, when there was a big famine going on, the Israeli government decided to step in, and in something called Operation Moses, or Mivtza Moshe, they airlifted thousands, close to 10,000 of these Ethiopian Jews into Eretz Yisrael from Sudan, which was officially at war with Israel, with the cooperation of the CIA and the Sudanese Special Service, and a lot of participating. It was like an open secret, kind of. It wasn't like such a secret, it was an open secret. And they airlifted thousands of Ethiopian Jews into Eretz Yisrael. And there was a need to now handle their actual, status, להלכה, of these Ethiopian Jews. Now, so before we talk about which poskim said what, and etc., let's talk about the different origin stories of these Ethiopians, where they might have came from to be Jewish, and then the different stories. Now, before we go into what their particular story is, I want to caution you that there's a lot of reason to believe that they're not Jewish, and all Ethiopians kind of think they're Jewish. Nothing to do with just this particular tribe. All Ethiopians have a shtickle dimyon that they're Jewish. And that starts from this. There's many versions of this story. It's even musker in some kind of midrashim, and the Arizal makes reference to it somewhere, Rav Chaim Vital makes reference to it somewhere, but I'll tell you the legend how it is, I can't tell you, I'll tell you the legend how it is. The legend goes as follows. The Psukim and Malachim tell us that Shlomo Melech's wisdom and fame spread throughout the world. And we know that Shlomo Melech was sourcing materials for the Beis HaMikdash, and through that he was interacting with different cultures, different people all over the world. And it says Malka Shva, who's in English called the Queen of Sheba, became enamored and infatuated with Shlomo Melech's Chachma, and she decided that she wanted to come meet Shlomo Melech. And this, the Psukim in Malachim all tell us. This is straight Psukim. And it says she gathered up thousands of camels with spices and gifts, and she made the long, arduous trip to get to Yerushalayim to meet Shlomo Melech. And they have a fantastic meeting. She presents him with many riddles to try to stump him and to see, if he is a chacham, he's not a chacham. There's very different versions of which riddles in particular she asked him. There's a list of 18 riddles that she asked him. Some make no sense, some do make sense. Whatever it is, there's different legends of the chachma. Now, at some point, here's where the legend starts. At some point, Shlomo Melech takes Malka Shva as one of his pilagshim, one of his many wives. We know Shlomo Melech was married to many different wives, many different places. And he sends her home eventually. Laden with gifts, he sends her home. Now it seems Malka Shva was pregnant. And on the way, it was a long trip back to wherever she was coming from, which legend has it is Ethiopia. And on the way, she gives birth to a baby whose name was a lot of different things, but the simplest version of his name is Melnik, or Menliki, or that's the simplest version of his name. And he grows up to be somewhat reminiscent of his father, King Solomon, of his father, Shlomo Melech. He's brilliant and he's capable, and at a certain point, when he hits adulthood, his mother sends him to Yerushalayim to meet Shlomo Melech, to meet his father, the king. Shlomo Melech is impressed with him, he likes him, and he wants to keep him in his court in Yerushalayim. But Lamaisi, he can't convince him to keep him in his court, and Beles Breri says, you know what, I'll make you the king of Ethiopia and the sub-Saharan or whatever, the African kingdoms, and I'll send you back on your way, and Shlomo Melech sends him back. Now, in order to send him back with the proper tools to be a king, Shlomo Melech sends him back with a whole group of advisors, of Shlomo Melech's team of advisors, to help him set up a proper government in Ethiopia where he's going. And there's many paintings of this, of a boat with a young black king with many white advisors surrounding him, and he sends him back to Ethiopia to be the king of Ethiopia. Now, here's where there's many different fanciful legends. I'll tell you one of them just because it's fascinating. This is a Christian legend, and the idea is to try to show that Hashem left Yerushalayim and moved somewhere else. It says, but that when Melnik left, he stole the Aron with him. He stole the Aron with the luchas inside of it and took it on the boat with him. Now Shlomo Melech chaps the Aron is stolen, and he prepares to set sail to chase him down to bring back the Aron. And Balaylahu, he has a dream. And in the dream, he sees the sun, it rises over Eretz Yisrael, and the people start shielding themselves from it and not respecting the sun and not taking it seriously. And the sun sets in anger and rises again over Rome and Ethiopia. And Shlomo Melech is said to have understood from that the Aron, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shechina, has moved from Eretz Yisrael, went to Ethiopia, and because of that, he doesn't chase the Aron. He just tells his people to craft a new Aron and surreptitiously put it back in the Beis Hamikdash so that nobody knows the Aron left. And this is now the Arizal and the Reb Chaim Vital. The place where this is actually a Jewish legend. So this is a mix because it starts with the psukim of Malka Shva, then it mixes in a lot of shtosim, and then there is something from the Arizal and the Mekubalim that say that Shlomo Melech married Malka Shva, and from his children was Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what caused the Beis Hamikdash to be destroyed, meaning Shlomo Melech was the one who caused it to be built and caused it to be destroyed. So there is like some sort of, Alpi Kabbalah, some sort of mascaras, that Shlomo Melech's child from Malka Shva ultimately leads to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. But this legend that the Ethiopians, if you'll Google for real, Ethiopian origin myths or Ethiopian legends, how they think they came about, this has become something that they consider to be an Inyan Shel Das. This is something they believe in completely. Your average Ethiopian person, as a matter of fact, many Ethiopian kings up to the 1900s would take the surname like either David or Shlomo. Many Ethiopian kings would call themselves whatever African name they had, many vowels and consonants that I'm not going to try to even pronounce, and then throw in a Shlomo or a David. So there is a big problem right off the bat with believing that anyone from Ethiopia who comes and says that he's a Jew is because there is a big part of the origin myth of the Ethiopian nation is that they all believe they're kind of Jews. As a matter of fact, they all believe that they kind of transplanted regular Jews. Regular Jews are lost it, and they're the real Jews. So it's very hard to you have to keep that in mind with all the legends that they're going to say. And if you'll ask two Ethiopians, you'll get three different answers as to where they became Jews from. Maybe more, maybe you get five. Like they don't even really know, and they don't really have a coherent or a cogent one particular legend that they say. Meaning by now, I'm sure they've solidified their story. But when they were coming to Eretz Yisrael in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and Rabbanim were interviewing different Ethiopians, even Rabbanim, they would call them, an Ethiopian rabbi is called a kas. The Kasim, when the Rabbanim would interview the Kasim as to how you became Jewish or where you come from, you asked two of them, you got five stories. They didn't know. They don't know, they didn't know. So you need to be cautious of the fact that there's this, origin myth of the whole Ethiopia. So now let's talk about where the one that the Paiskim who are makel about them and say that they are Jews mostly want to be Seimachan. Now, Rav Ovadia Yosef in 1973 wrote a seminal tshuva that really set the stage for the Operation Moses to bring all the Ethiopians. Rav Ovadia was asked by the agent of the government who was draying with the Jews in Ethiopia, what is the status of these Jews? And Rav Ovadia strongly concludes, now it's important to keep in mind, he's not handling a halacha shayla. He's handling the shayla of rescuing them, of saving them, of treating them like long-lost brothers. Not, could you marry them? Not, could they be treated as Jews? That's not his question. And Rav Ovadia strongly says that Acham Anachnu, this is part of the Kibbutz Galius, these are people who are Jews that are very far away from us. We need to embrace them and love them and welcome them back to Eretz Yisrael with a warm hug. Now, based on this tshuva in 1973, the Israeli government included the law of return, that says that any person who's a Jew anywhere in the world could be brought back to Israel and could gain citizenship. They included the law of return, the umbrella of the law of return, to include these Ethiopian Jews. Now, nothing happened right away, but in 1985, when the opportunity presented itself to airlift thousands of these Jews, the government, based on Rav Ovadia's psak, or psak-ish, from that time, decided to airlift all these Jews. Now, I'm telling you this because this is going to be a very important part of the controversy. What exactly Rav Ovadia held and how much he stuck to what he held is going to be very, very consequential to the protest that we started with in the beginning. But before we talk about the actual psakim, let's talk about Eldad Hadani for a second. Now, Eldad Hadani is a somewhat known person. Let's rewind the clock, because Rav Ovadia was Seimach on a tshuva from the Radvaz, who was Seimach on the story of Eldad Hadani, and based on those things is how they got to this psak that allows to treat them as brothers. So what is Eldad Hadani's story? Now, Eldad Hadani's story is strangely something that most Rishonim believed in. Meaning most Rishonim who heard Eldad Adani believed in him. Now there's a bit of a bifurcation, there's a bit of a split, because Eldad Adani told a marvelous story, and that's the part I want to share. And Eldad Adani also told many halachas, in particular in Hilchos Shchita and Hilchos Treifus. Almost all of them are machtavek by the Poskim and don't make it to Shulchan Aruch. There is one that does make it to Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah quotes this din, and that is there's a din. The Ramah says it's a minig. The Ramah says the minig is that women are not allowed to shecht. That's what the Ramah says. Now, if you look through an entire Gemara Chulin, Bavli, not Yerushalmi. If you look through Yerushalmi, it won't be there either. And all the other sources, you will not find a din that nashim are not supposed to be sheichet. Me'ikar adin. We don't paskin like that. It comes from Eldad Adani. It comes from the Hilchos Shchita of Eldad Adani, and the Ramah brings it down that that's the minig that we don't shecht. I believe. It could be I'm wrong. Could be I'm speaking too strongly. But I think like Mir and Kaf. Now, many other minhagim in Hilchos Shchita and Hilchos Treifus are brought down from Eldad Adani, and they're machtavek by the Merami Rotenberg, by the Rosh, by other poskim who say that no, we don't. These are not halachas. This is not a masar. We don't listen to these halachas. But in regards to his etzem story of who he is and the story that he told, there many more Rishonim believed in him. As a matter of fact, Rav Tzemach Gaon has a letter that we have today. I can't give vouch for its authenticity, but there's a letter from Rav Tzemach Gaon in Igeris from Rav Tzemach Gaon where he quotes the story of Eldad Adani, and he says even though not all of it could be true, but zichar a good percentage of it could be true, and he seems to buy it. So what is the story of Eldad Adani? What does it have to do with our discussion? So Eldad Adani, as his name might imply, as his name might give away, claimed to be from Shevet Dan, Eldad Hadani. He claimed to be from Shevet Dan. Now Eldad Adani shows up on the scene in the year 880. A long time ago, over 1,000 years ago, in the year 880, he shows up on the scene first in Bavel, then in Egypt, to many different kinds of Jews, and he tells a fascinating story. He says, I come from Hari Kush, beyond Hari Kush, deep into the mountains of Africa. Hari Kush is Pachas Yosef, where Ethiopia should be. He says, I come from there, and me and my friend, he says, I'm from Shevet Dan, my friend was from Shevet Asher, and me and my friend, keep in mind, these are Shvatim that no one's heard anything from at that point, over 1,000 years. By now, thousands of years. He says, I come from Shevet Dan, my friend comes from Shevet Asher, and we were going for business on a boat, probably on the Nile River, one of the tributaries of the Nile River, and it came at night, a big storm, and the boat was tzahakt and tzaklapt, and we couldn't survive the storm, and I grabbed a hold of one plank of wood that remained floating, and my friend also saw that this was working. He grabbed onto the plank of wood, and b'chemlas Hashem, we washed up on a bank of a river somewhere. Me and him totally spent out of koiches. When the sun rose and the morning came, we saw these big, he describes them as undressed, big black men standing around us. They had no clothing. He says they lived like the animals of the field, and they surrounded us, and whatever way they were able to communicate, they took us into their custody. And he says, and their culture is that they eat humans, some sort of cannibalizing culture. And he says, my friend from Shevet Asher, he was a rather rotund fellow, and he was a delectable meal. He made the first night's dinner. My friend from Shevet Asher, he was well fed, he was fat, he was, they took him, they ate him right away. He says, me, I was very skinny, and they didn't see the tachlis of having me for dinner, so they put me into a cage, and they would give me food every day to try to fatten me up and prepare me for dinner at some point that I'll be available. And he says, but because I would not eat treif, whatever they would give me, I would dig a small hole in the ground, and I would bury it down there, and I would say I just have a great metabolism. I can't get fattened up. It doesn't matter what you feed me. I'm thin. And he says I was just getting thinner and thinner instead of getting fatter and fatter. And eventually, they felt I was not worth it. I would make no great culinary selection. So they sold me off to a different tribe. I was passed from tribe to tribe. And finally, I landed in a place where there were some Jews. They were paid to me, and here I am with my marvelous story. Now, what's the story? He says, where I live, behind Hari Kush, behind this raging river that spat me out onto an island somewhere with some cannonballs, there's the rest of the Aseres HaShvatim, all the Shvatim that are missing from Klal Yisrael, and he goes in to describe in great detail who does what and who lives where, what they do for Parnasa, which ones are hunters, which ones are traders, which ones are Tamidei Chachamim, and he describes them with mile markers and geographical points that we don't know what they mean. We never knew what they mean. They've never been found. Meaning the geographical markers that he describes are just out there somewhere. He describes these geographical markers. And Eldad Adani's letter has caused many a man to go literally to his death, chasing the legend of the Aseres HaShvatim to go to find them. Now, this is his story that he comes with. This is Eldad Adani. Now, but the underlying kernel of what he's saying is that somewhere deep past the Hari Kush, deep into Africa, behind the mountains of Kush, in the dark mountains of Kush, there's Shevet Dan that lives there. Now, many years later, hundreds of years later, during the Radvaz's Tkufa, this is in the 1500s, so it's a good 600 and change years later, an Eved, again, a Pidin Shvuyin case arose. Someone was captured and was brought on a boat, and the question was to redeem him or not. And the Radvaz was presented with the Shaila, and the Radvaz says to redeem this guy. Now, I want to read you from the Radvaz, because look what the Radvaz says. The Radvaz says, Aval elu haba me'eretz Kush. These people who show up from Eretz Kush, hey mi shevet dan b'li safek. They come from Shevet Dan, without a doubt. Since they didn't have any Talmidei Chachamim, Bali Mesaira, tafsu lahem pshutei aksuvim. They just came to develop a way of leading their life with pshutei aksuvim. If we would teach them, they wouldn't argue with the transmission, with the Masoretic chain. They're considered, even though they're hundreds of years removed, or thousands of years removed from Klal Yisrael's Mesaira, they're considered like tinik shenishmu bein ha'akum. Tell you that? These people went to Galos before Tzdukim even existed. They're not part of Tzdukim, they just don't know. They're regular Amaratzim. Even if you're going to find that it's a Safek, it's a mitzvah to be paid to them. Now, this is then he actually brings, in a different tshuva, in a later tshuva, he brings Hadavar Meforsim, that there's always wars, and he's literally quoting from Eldad Adani's letters. That there's wars over there at all times, and these people are fine. So the Radvaz was Saimach on Eldad Hadani's story that Shevet Dan ended up a Hari Kush, and that's how they got to be there. Now, I'll end with this, and we'll have to save the rest of the dispute to the Paiskim and many, many more details for next week. But how did they get to Eretz Kush? Meaning, how did they end up there? Because if you look in the Psukim, Chazal tell us Eser Galus Golsu Avesenu. 10 times Klal Yisrael went to Galus in different groups. And if you look in the Psukim in Malachim, in the Yamim, in Yeshaya, you're going to see different groups going to Galus at different times. But it never says that they go to Hari Kush. It doesn't say that. The Psukim tell us different places they went. It never says that Shevet Dan went to Hari Kush. So what did Eldad Adani say to resolve that? Eldad Adani said another fascinating story that has no other makar besides him. He said, early in the days of the split of Klal Yisrael, when Yeravim ben Nevat formed a separatist kingdom in the north of Israel to fight against Rechavam, the son of Shlomo Melech, and Klal Yisrael split into two pieces, Malchi Yehuda and Malchi Yisrael, the Dananites, the Shevet Dan, who were part of the Malchi Yehuda, Malchi Yisrael, were considered a warrior culture. They were a very strong warrior culture. Now it's ironic because if you look in the Psukim in Yeshua, Shevet Dan is from one of the Shvatim that were never even matzliach to conquer their own land in Eretz Yisrael. Meaning the Nachal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them, Shevet Dan was not even matzliach to conquer. So it's just funny that the legend is that Shevet Dan were the warrior culture, and they were called on by Klal Yisrael to go do battle with Rechavam. Let's go have a war, let's fight Rechavam. And they said, rather, instead of battling our brothers and creating a civil war, we'd rather travel away and go. And they left, and it says a whole migration story. They went to Egypt, and there they almost got into a war. Then they went down the Nile, they charted the course. Now, one has to know the Nile is a complicated river. There's the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and where they go, and where there's tremendous rapids that you can't get through. We'll save this, but a lot of the people who handle the origin pick holes in this part, because it's very hard to get through the Nile from Egypt down to Ethiopia. But be that as it may, Eldad Adani suggests that this early contingent of Shevet Dan made this trip, and they ended up in Ethiopia. So now this is a legendary story that Eldad Adani told that many Rishonim believed. Granted, Rami Rotenberg and Rav Ibn Ezra and others did not believe it, but Rav Tzemach Gaon and other Rishonim seemed to quote it without a problem. And the Radvaz was Saimach on it lahalacha to say that an Eved who came, you have to be paid him because he's considered from Shevet Dan. Now Rav Adia took that old legend and transplanted it to the 21st century, to the Shaila of the Ethiopian Jews. Many other Paiskim had strong disagreements with it. I think we'll save that for next week. There's a lot more to the story to get to.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.